The Jetsons 1963 issue 9. There's a page where George almost gets hit by a car and hears the sound of the Roadrunner, and complains about faster than sound drivers. I kinda like that joke. Someone on TV reports that the future's Davy Crockett the bear tracker is coming to their city. It'd be lame if the city was never given a name. It's easy to think, what are the chances the future would have its own version of celebrities that were famous in the 60s that have similar names and roles? It's more likely than what Futurama did, but still. Well, it'd be more believable if the past of the Jetsons world never had people like Davy Crockett, Elvis Presley, and so on. So that's why nobody ever lampshades a future celebrity's similarity. That and there's nobody from the past there. Maybe it's that humanity started 60 years earlier in this universe, so by the time Elvis Presley was born, it was the future. Oh, what a coincidence! Davy Crockett is George's cousin. He's proud of him, so I'm guessing this will be a broken pedestal plot. Jane doesn't need to make fun of him that he's nothing like his cousin, who he calls a hero for merely following a bear, unless he saved people from it. George assumes Davy doesn't brag and is shy and modest, only to find out he was wrong and get shook too much by his handshake. So what a shame that he never got to know his cousin until now. Davy doesn't need to say George is puny for living in a city. It's interesting that he establishes that he's not from the city, because we always think of the Jetsons world as being one way. But there are rural areas. Davy brags about his tracking skills. I wish I knew what he meant by solar sneakers. I guess they have little solar panels on them. And he should have said, even if he was wearing, because otherwise he's sounding silly, implying that a non-sentient creature could be wearing sneakers. Let me guess, the plot twist is that Davy's a liar. Then how did he get his reputation? He explains why he came to the city if he can't see why people live in one. A bounty he got for catching the solar bear needs to be put in the bank, which unexplored planets don't have. And he wants George to take him there. Elroy decides to tag along, and once again we see some robbers run out of the bank having just robbed it. I wonder if we'll ever see a bank in this comic without it being robbed. Not that I'm complaining, it's just a funny series of coincidences. The Jetsons sure have an exciting life running into criminals all the time. Davy gets robbed, and he and his family get sprayed with gas that merely makes them cough while the criminals make a quick getaway. What makes them even smarter is that they froze people with freeze rays that wear off quickly. But not so quickly that it'd keep them from escaping them. Davy doesn't know how to track down the criminals because they don't even know what kind of car they had. George gets his time to shine, saying that it sounded like a certain car because all jet cars sound different when they take off, depending on the brand. He could tell that the car had a worn thrust rod because it sputtered. George flies his car and recognizes the smell of Solar 6 fuel. Davy explains how he would track an animal some more, and George assumes the car must be around here because he's at the end of the scent trail. He can tell the car was just parked because the engine's still warm. It's so admirable that he's being smart and staying that way. I'm not being taken out of the story the whole time. George guesses that the reason they abandoned the car is that it's a stolen one only being used for a getaway. He assumes the criminals went to the subways because an old commuter like him knows the best place to travel unnoticed in the city. So he drives the car towards a hole in the pavement, knowing every stop in town. Finally, Davy's useful because his keen eyesight has him spot the crooks. He thinks it's tougher to push past the crowd than hack through the wilderness, as we see a woman who looks too much like Jane. There's people who look similar to others by coincidence in real life, and they hire those doppelgangers to be stunt doubles sometimes. I'm just wondering why the colorist chose to color the character the same way as the main one, when it's not any less effort. George borrows a mic from the announcement desk and says free subway tokens are being given away at the token office, which gets people to run a certain direction and lets George get to the subway car easily. Would George be arrested for this? Wouldn't there be a camera? Davy smacks the heads of the criminals together, and the story cuts past the bank giving George his reward. which he put in the bank, so we didn't even get to see what he spent it on. Davy says they've got quite the father there. Elroy hugs George, calling him his hero, and the story ends with Judy calling George amazing, while the writer has George say blah a few times, which always ruins the immersion. In the next story, Judy happily tells her parents that she's a finalist in the Terra Queen contest at the Solar Fair. Her parents congratulate her, and for no reason, Judy assumes George is just joking when he says he'll rig the contest for her. She says that they're keeping the judge's identity a secret this year. It's common sense. So why didn't they do that earlier? Especially since last year the parents of all the girls who lost took it out on the judge. Now remembering Sabrina, where such a judge was turned into a frog. Judy puts her arms around her parents, and George puts his hand on Judy and Jane's shoulders as Jane says her daughter's pretty. Jane's gonna help her daughter for tomorrow, and George wishes he could help. He complains that he only gets a measly $100 an hour. So he works 9 hours a day to get another day another $900. But I remember learning that he works far less hours than 9 a day. So if that's true for the story, this is a different universe. 12 seconds later, George complains that he's especially late because he had a breakdown on the subway and it took 6 whole seconds to fix it. It gives me the biggest smile to see jokes like this. That's definitely how people in the future would be. George doesn't want his boss to catch him just coming in, so he hides behind the corner as he's looking for him. Luckily, someone announces that Spacely's wanted on the telephone, and a little floating thing with a helicopter blade above it brings him a cell phone. Spacely wanted to say, "Why yes, I'd be happy to judge the event." That's so stilted. He wouldn't parrot back what he said, and that's the only reason George finds out his new secret. George decides to work with both hands to impress his boss in the hopes of getting him to favor his daughter. Spacely said he didn't think he'd be at work yet and that he underestimated him. George advised him to get to know his employees better and invites him to dinner. Spacely would just say no, not walk away unhappily. Jane doesn't like that Spacely showed up because the house is a mess. What happened to Rosie? It'd only be a mess if this was her day off and Jane was too lazy to have cleaned up already. She even says she hasn't had time to clean the house. She turns on the vacuutron, and that sends Spacely into it, and Judy says she told George to fix it. He gets into a chair all dirtied up, and after he doesn't like how Judy looks with her curlers or whatever on, he ends up happy that he got to eat Jane's cooking. He pets Judy, and you'd think he'd know this is the same girl he saw earlier. So what he says would only make sense if he was being metaphorical. She thanks him. He thanks George, who somehow says trick instead of pleasure. The story knew to skip past the boredom of the actual beauty contest. George could have easily not admitted that Spacely was the judge. Of course it got Judy upset. She cries, saying she's gonna give up the crown because she didn't win fairly, and George tells Spacely that he deliberately influenced his decision. He tells Spacely not to call Judy a horse. It turns out Spacely was only judging a horse show, and that cheers Judy up. Spacely fires George for trying to butter him up, only to rehire him at increased salary for confessing. Jane gets the credit for this, for encouraging George to do that. The story ends with Judy hugging George and calling him the best father ever, even though it was completely unearned and came out of nowhere. She should still be mad at him. In the next story, Jane and George leave the house, with the writing seeming to be too lazy to explain where they're going, and they want Rosie to babysit Elroy because Judy's at a slumber party. George offers to pay Rosie a little extra for babysitting, establishing that maidbots do get paid directly, even though they're robots. She stupidly turns down being paid extra because she doesn't want to strap the Jetsons. And Elroy says he's playing Electro hide-and-seek with Astro. He uses a Magno mutt finder to detect a transistor in Astro's collar, effortlessly finding him. What's the point of hide-and-seek if it's that easy? Rosie tells him it's bedtime now, and Elroy asks if he could listen to a book before going to sleep, and Rosie agrees as long as it's short. Elroy wants an exciting audiobook, and he picked a book about Tom Sawyer, Won't that not be a short one? So why does the text box say shortly? It must be a book about only one short adventure of his, because that's a famous book. Elroy finds his life boring. He has a machine automatically write a note saying that he's running away for adventure for a few years, getting a blatant idiot ball. It sounds like this word's impossible to buy, that he modifies his toy guns and stuff in the show. He'd know he'd have to catch up on schoolwork and have to deal with being the shortest one in his grade until high school if he didn't get caught up with. And doesn't he care about how his family feels at all? He blatantly said he loves his family too much to run away to the cold moon. He flies away with rocket shoes, leaving the house. Rosie very conveniently goes back to Elroy's room, telling him that it's time to shut off his book and sleep, instead of assuming he'd have already done that. It's not like the audiobook was still going on and she could hear it from outside the room. She blames herself for not watching him closer when she had no reason to expect him to decide to run away after bedtime, so she would have never had a reason to stay in his room until he fell asleep. She decides to call the Space Patrol on the video phone, and someone there tells her they'll beam his description throughout the solar system. Like that would be very helpful. How many blonde kids with green outfits are there? She says that if there's anyone that could find Elroy, it's Astro, but since he's gone too, she decides to use the Astro locator she was shown earlier. How did he forget about that? How does she ever know where to start looking? That would only make sense if the locator was able to detect the transistor from really far away. So I guess it does, and she followed it here, to the worst section of town. I guess Elroy only came to this neighborhood because he didn't know better. Elroy complains that he's hungry, and he was never told what Tom Sawyer did when he wanted a snack. How could the writer of Tom Sawyer forget to explain something so important? Elroy remembers he has a lucky dollar in the form of a coin, which would buy him and Astro a couple of jet burgers. Why would they be called jet burgers? Someone says being an undercover cop in this tough neighborhood isn't easy, and recognizes Elroy. So he and his coworker run after him, but for some reason they don't yell after him to explain themselves. So he assumes they're after his money and runs into a condemned building. Somehow, Elroy thinks the old house is as scary as robbers when there's nothing to hurt him in there. Rosie bursts through the wall of the house. No wonder it was condemned. Its materials rusted away to worthlessness. Elroy gets reassured by these people who tell Rosie they're policemen, but because he didn't show Rosie their badges, she accuses them of lying and makes them leave. While she and Elroy do happen to be wrong, it's so heartwarming to see that she trusts Elroy so much that she'd take his word over these strangers who could have easily actually been robbers. She effortlessly breaks down the door, because making mere maid bots have super strength is totally necessary and won't backfire on anybody. She breaks another door and picks up the men, saying that she's taking them to the police station. Elroy's amazed at how well Rosie demolished that place. I hope she doesn't get in trouble, because it was already condemned. Although this did mean the people in charge of destroying it later won't get paid for doing so, but she didn't know. Rosie finds out her mistake. Someone rushes into the room asking if she's the robot who knocked down his building, and of course he wants to thank her because she did that in record time faster than his own records. So he shakes her hand and says he's got an offer to make, which would reward her for cheating those records out of a day's paycheck. As Rosie goes home with her family, she generously tells Elroy she won't tell his parents about the stupid thing he did because the scare he got was punishment enough. Those men weren't trying to rob him, so probably shouldn't have taught him that he made a mistake. But the fact that he didn't know where to get a snack was more than enough to tell the audience that Elroy was making a mistake. But it should have shown him looking hopeless after he spent that money. He didn't get a chance to figure out it was a mistake. Rosie talks him into bed, saying that they're lucky the police were so understanding. Yeah, but I'll gladly take that over the alternative. George goes home and asks Rosie if everything went alright. She says it went just fine without hesitation, and then says she got a part-time job offer, and politely asks to take it, and says it wouldn't interfere with her duties here. They must be assuming she got called up randomly, because they aren't asking how she got the offer. Jane says she doesn't mind, And later on, Elroy says that whenever he wants excitement, he can watch Rosie wreck some buildings, along with some other smiling people watching her. I like that Rosie has a hat for once while bragging that she wrecked 9 houses so far and didn't even dent a kneecap. But she doesn't have knees. Seriously, why would they make literally any robot have super strength? In the next story, Jane asks George if he's sure he wants to do this as he's going outside holding a briefcase. And he says that since Spacely won't give him a promotion and raise, he'll have to take this part-time job selling brushes. Why does he have to? He was able to survive without doing this before. He warns Jane not to mention to Spacely where he is if he calls for some reason, because Spacely doesn't like his employees to have 2 jobs, because he's a selfish asshole. Can't think of any other reason. This panel already makes me think Spacely's gonna talk to her. It's not like he's a doctor or cop. Why is he expected to always be at his beck and call? He's not forced to be at work all day for a reason, because they don't need him to always be there pressing the buttons. They could get a robot's help instead of asking an employee who isn't at work. George has a book to make a salesman out of him. But go figure, he's told no by his first customer. He should have expected this, because everyone knows what door-to-door salesmen are treated like. She sicks an automatic brush after him to sweep him away, and he's lucky he grabbed onto the edge. How far a fall did he just avoid? That was dark. There should be a railing there. He ends up being told to stay out by everyone on the block. I hope for his sake that he wasn't talking to any of his own neighbors. George reads some advice that he has to try a new area that's far away, so he hopes the company would accept Martian money. It's surprisingly realistic that he reveals Martians have their own money, even if there couldn't be sentient native Martians on an airless planet like that. Since George doesn't need an air bubble over his head, this means Mars was terraformed enough to have Earth's atmosphere. Still, that would have happened too recently for a unique sentient life to evolve there. So any sentient life identifying as Martians would only really be native Martians if they were the ancestors of new species intentionally created to be sentient beings on Mars. Or this alien's ancestors do not come from Mars, and he's only a Martian in nationality. Humans have no reason to create new sentient life specifically so they would live on Mars, when they could just hope humans would buy property there instead. George walks past a sign that says Mars that wouldn't be there because everybody here knows the planet they're on. Realistically, George doesn't know this alien is the lady of the house, and because she's magical, she can fire fireballs at him to scare him away. He should have known better than to ask if the lady of the house is home. It's not like only women use brushes, so why would a man be offended at him selling him brushes? He gets kicked away by another alien, supposedly living on Jupiter, when even the people of the 60s should have known it's a gas planet that's unlivable, and has crazy gravity he's not suffering from. And yet he seems to be on the surface of it and not on a satellite. So this Jupiter must be the size of Earth. It has to be Jupiter in name only. Is it even possible that Earth would form in a solar system where Jupiter and Uranus weren't giant gas planets that sucked away stuff to them from their gravity, like any asteroids aiming for Earth? It's far more believable that these aren't Jupiter and Uranus, but other Earth-like planets that share the same names. They need a lot of witches to ally with mortals to combine their powers to be able to transform an entire gas planet into an Earth-like one. On Uranus, George can't even find the door to a building. There still must be a way to get in. Do witches live here, or is there an underground entrance? George returns to Earth, saying that he traveled a measly 3 million miles. I'm guessing this means we're supposed to actually believe he remained in his own solar system. So people really did get witches to shapeshift the gas planets, and covered it up saying it was science that did it, because who would ever believe someone who said otherwise? Or everyone knows about witches in this universe. George reads the book telling him that if all else fails, he should pick the first house he sees and force the person inside to buy an item without taking no for an answer. But the book is useless by not explaining how to do that, so it's just giving insanely irresponsible advice encouraging breaking the law, and getting the door-to-door salesman hurt or killed. It's certainly unique to see a story where one of the likable main characters knows what it's like to be in this job. And it would be boring and repetitive that he always gets told no like you expect if it weren't for the alien stuff. He should choose a different house after being faced with a robot. who gives him a good excuse that the owners have company. He could have very easily not had to be threatened by one of the owners, a big tough guy, because he was just told they're busy talking to people. Why did he come to the door? After the door slams, shockingly, George decides to knock on it again. At least he tries to look cool by having his turbo brush slap his head while floating. Then he slides into the house on jet scrubber skates. He can't stop though because these things don't stop until they run out of soap. Because they're badly made. And he's heading up the stairs. So he ends up heading for the edge of a platform and falling onto his boss's dinner table by some wild coincidence. The man apologizes to Spacely for the interruption and says George will do anything to make a sale. Spacely likes that he has so much spunk in him, even though he's not a salesman in his career. And yet he says he admires the man with get up and go, and tells him to see him tomorrow about a promotion and raise. Unless the promotion has to do with being a salesman, how is he supposed to take advantage of this spunk? He's thankful for Fuller brushes because of the raise, and because he sees a Fuller brush salesman heading for his house, he calls him pal, and we see the most heartwarming ending for a door-to-door salesman where he thinks, nicest couple I ever met. They invited me in for dinner and bought all my brushes. Then there's a comedy page where we see George flying a spaceship with a push lever as if a steering wheel isn't way easier for making turns. He finds out it's out of fuel, and he says fortunately because he's already within the Earth's orbit and heading for it. Still, he'd need a way to eject himself and have a parachute to survive this. Because no fuel means no ability to stop either. The first story was about George's cousin, a bear tracker, coming to visit to make a bank deposit, and thankfully instead of the cliche twist where it turns out the braggart was lying and never deserved his fame, George tracks down gadget-carrying bank robbers using his knowledge of city life. I love that he was competent the whole time. But the most impressive part is that at no point was it forced that he was able to follow the robbers, because he always had a good reason to figure out what he did. If I had to stretch to find a flaw in the story, it'd be that there was no conflict that lasted more than a second because it was so easy for George. But I didn't mind. The plot needed to be in the future to happen as it did because George could tell which flying car was which by sound alone. The second story was about George finding out his daughter is a finalist in a beauty contest and eavesdropping on Spacely somehow parroting back what someone says to him over the phone when he's trying to sneak to his desk, which caused him to think Spacely is the judge of the contest. He invites him to dinner to butter him up. Things go wrong at first to create tension, and then Jane's cooking saves the day, and Judy gets upset with George when he arbitrarily reveals that he thought Spacely was the judge because she wanted to win fairly. But then because Jane tells George to confess to Spacely about his plan, they find out he was only judging horses, and just so happened to be judging a contest that was right next to Judy's and was heading their direction afterwards. The only reason this plot needed sci-fi to happen was that George heard Spacely's phone call in the hallway because a holophone was brought to him, which could have been a cell phone if this was modern times. Otherwise, it was just a decent sitcom plot. Elroy's story is about Rosie having to babysit Elroy for a second, just for him to grab the idiot ball and decide that running away from home like Tom Sawyer won't have any consequences. But Rosie conveniently checks his bedroom for no reason and magically finds out he's gone. She should have just glanced out the window by happenstance and seen him flying away with rocket shoes. The sci-fi comes in when Rosie uses an Astro detector to check his gun to track down Elroy because he brought Astro along to avoid loneliness. And then when some undercover cops looking for Elroy run after him, they're too stupid to tell him why for no reason, causing him to hide in a condemned building with walls so shoddy that Rosie bursts through one just because she's a robot. She takes his word for it that they're trying to rob him and gets everyone out of the building, which she destroys effortlessly. For this to make sense, I have to assume robots are only made super strong in case something heavy falls on their owner and they need it to be lifted up. And because it could defend them from burglars. How could they be made that strong by accident? Elroy never gets told what the actual consequences of running away would be beyond going hungry. He didn't even learn that lesson because he was happy that he had $1 for burgers. He should have spent it and realized he was screwed after that. And he was never actually in danger. So it's too bad he's not properly called out on what he did. But I liked Rosie's happy ending. It's just that it didn't last long enough for Elroy to actually learn a lesson and have there be a point. The last story was about George trying to make some extra money as a door-to-door salesman. It required being sci-fi when he tried selling to aliens, which made me wish the planets were called something else, and when he started sliding ahead on soap with jet skates, which caused him to fall onto Spacely's table by insanely unlikely coincidence, and get a raise because of his sheer determination, because apparently, Spacely's fine with him having a second job. Because he was just that spunky. Then why'd he talk as if he was against his employees having 2 jobs if he admires a person with spunk and get up and go, which would be part of that in the first place? So George telling Jane not to tell his boss worried me for nothing. I'm glad she didn't somehow end up telling him what he did, and instead there was a happy ending where Spacely was a good boss. It was certainly unique to see the main character be a door-to-door salesman. And there's a reason this isn't usually done. We're still gonna find him annoying when he tries to push his products on people, and it's very repetitive to see him get told no over and over.